Good evening, and thank you for joining us today. My name is John Green III. I'm a proud alumnus of the School of Business, class of 2000, 2004, and 2020. Volunteer and president of the Cary Business School's Black Alumni Network. I'm honored to serve as your host and moderator for tonight's conversation, exploring the history of African Americans at Hopkins. This virtual program is free and open to the public as part of the 5th annual Black Alumni Weekend, sponsored by the Society of Black Alumni. This year's events also commemorate Johns Hopkins' 150th anniversary, highlighting the many contributions of African Americans to our institution. Tonight, you'll hear stories and perspectives spanning decades and divisions, an interactive look at how the African American experience at Hopkins has evolved over time. We'll begin with a presentation from Allison Seyler, Program Manager for Hopkins Retrospective. Following that, I'll moderate a panel discussion with alumni and faculty representing multiple eras of the school: Dr. LaMarr Darnell Shields, Dr. Leslie Farrington, Wilbur Wright, Dr. Deneen Hendrick, and Lindsai Bland. We'll then open the floor to our live audience for your questions and reflections. For those of you watching live, please utilize the chat feature below throughout our presentation and conversation. We'll be gathering them throughout the broadcast and hope this addresses as many questions as possible during the Q&A at the end. With that, let's get started. Allison, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this evening's program. Specifically to Elena Thompson, I appreciate you including me. As the Hopkins Retrospective Program Manager, it's my job to research and share university history with the community in meaningful ways. Sometimes that takes the shape of a distinct research project. Other times it takes the shape of supporting students doing archival research. And more often than not, it involves learning from our community in order to share a more complete story. So I'm excited for this evening's program. I am hoping to emphasize right now off the bat that I'm no expert, but I have some grounding in the institution's historical records, with which I hope to set the stage for our alumni to share their stories and experiences. To start this evening's program, I'll offer some notes on African American history at Hopkins, touching on some key figures and moments, as well as challenges. And just to reiterate, this overview is not all encompassing. You're going to hear some highlights from some different departments and divisions, but not everything will be covered this evening. To begin, I'll say that when Johns Hopkins, the founder, shared his intention to found a university and a hospital, as well as an orphan's asylum, he did so with a will and a letter to his trustees. He left very little information in his will about what he wanted for the university. There's just one paragraph that emphasizes having scholarships for young white men from states where he did business. And in his letter to the trustees, he spelled out much more detail for the hospital. One of the key elements was that the hospital was required to serve the, quote, indigent sick of the city and its environs without regard to sex, age, or color, who may require surgical or medical treatment. Johns himself had been sick with cholera in the 1830s and had seen firsthand the medical care in Baltimore. In practice, once Johns Hopkins passed away, it was up to the trustees to fulfill his wishes, and they did so a bit unevenly. I should also mention that there was no explicit language on whether or not the university should accept Black students into its programs. However, in 1876, when the year the school was founded, the surrounding city was heavily segregated and steeped in a post-Civil War era where Southern sympathizers, including a faculty member, were influential in making the decisions on how the school should operate. I'm gonna just go through a couple of slides now. This is the early original campus downtown, closer to where the Peabody campus is today in the 1870s. So this is what the school looked like when it first opened. This is what some of the students looked like when the school first opened, as well as one of the sports teams on their horse and carriage. So it's in this environment that the first Black student, Kelly Miller, enrolled and took courses in astronomy, mathematics, and physics at Hopkins. He started in 1887, but shortly left in 1889. He went on to teach at Howard University and eventually became the dean of their College of Arts and Sciences. There's no extant documents that I've found that directly explain why he left Hopkins in his own words, though some historians have inferred that it was due to financial strain because of the university's increased tuition costs. They actually doubled in those years. Other folks have made alternative suggestions about why Miller left. Historian Hugh Hawkins wrote, quote, "The local atmosphere must have been chilling. A young faculty member knew of no place in Baltimore where he could take as his luncheon guest a fellow Amherst alumnus, a Black man then teaching at Howard," end quote. After Miller left, it would be more than 50 years until a Black student openly applied and was accepted to Hopkins. One student prior to that, that was recently written about and will be in our upcoming history of Hopkins that will be coming out during the sesquicentennial year, was Catherine Lane. She actually attended Hopkins in 1942, and the Afro-American newspaper reported that, quote, "The Hopkins administration ducked under her fair skin as an opening wedge," end quote, perhaps implying that her presence there was done with passing. Since there was no explicit policy banning Black students at Hopkins, there came a time where integration just sort of began based on the expressed interest of the students and persistence. University leadership was not in a position to avoid the topic any longer, especially in a post-World War II era. Discussions about where Black students could study across the nation grew. So in 1945, a young man most here will know, Frederick Scott, applied and was accepted to Hopkins. After a short time serving in the Army during World War II, he graduated in 1950 with a degree in chemical engineering. A deeply intellectually curious person, Frederick pursued a career in publishing and editing scientific and trade journals. And perhaps his most significant legacy is felt by the alumni today as the namesake of a sacred alumni group, the Fred Scott Brigade. Not long after his enrollment, other Black students began to attend Hopkins. Another early Black student who wound up on the arts and sciences side, Ernie Bates, entered the university in 1954 and graduated in 1958. Bates received a full academic scholarship to pursue biology and along the way actually played football and ran track. Baltimore remained, as I mentioned earlier, an intensely segregated city in the 1950s with a microcosm of that on Hopkins campus and specifically in the dorm. Ernie Bates was known for creating a safe space for other Black students in his dorm room. He let them leave their books, lunches, coats, etc. In his room while they went to class, especially because a lot of them were living off campus. Bates went on to earn his medical degree, join the Air Force, and complete a residency to become one of the first 3 Black board-certified neurosurgeons in the US. The university actually recently honored both men, Frederick Scott and Ernie Bates, by renaming the Charles Commons, which is now known as the Scott Bates Commons. When Hopkins accepted its first class of women, undergraduate women students in 1970, among the 90 total who were both made of freshmen and upper level transfer students, there were just 5 Black women in that class: Karen Freeman, Shirley Dillsworth, Gail Williams, Lynn Park, and Barbara Weish. These women laid the groundwork for others that would come after them. And just as an aside here, I wanted to share some photographs from Dr. Farrington, who will be giving us a little more detail about these snapshots. So thank you very much for sharing those. Some of the women that I just mentioned are actually in these photographs as well. I won't spend too much time talking about the health institutions since the alumni we're speaking with tonight aren't hailing from those parts, but I did want to mention a couple of significant figures just for some Black history at Hopkins. Incredibly important to the story of medicine were the pioneering Black students and doctors who paved the way for today's students and practitioners. In terms of students on the medical side, Reginald G. James was admitted to the School of Hygiene's Master of Public Health program, which is now the School of Public Health, actually in 1944. He received a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship, and he had already been serving as a U.S. public health officer in D.C. He finished his degree in 1946, becoming the first Black graduate of the university And he played a pivotal role actually in the South, helping the Alabama State Health Department with a campaign against syphilis among Black men and specifically men in the armed forces. Admittedly, there's many stories of successful Black faculty and staff at the hospital and School of Medicine, but I wanted to highlight two folks in particular. One of them is Vivian Thomas, also pictured here. In 1944, pediatric cardiologist Helen Taussig, surgery director Alfred Blaylock, and surgical technician Vivian Thomas devised a way to correct a deadly heart defect. Their Blue Baby operation, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, not only saved thousands of lives at the time, but it proved that surgery involving the heart was possible. And today that procedure has been renamed to honor the contributions of Vivian Thomas, and now it's referred to as the Blaylock Thomas Taussig Shunt. Importantly, the university also took steps to establish a long-term and sustained way to honor Thomas, and they launched the Vivian Thomas Scholars Initiative, which provides full funding for scholars to pursue a doctorate in a STEM PhD field. And so far, there's been 54 scholars between who pursuing 21 different disciplines across the 4 divisions, which is really exciting. Another leader in the field of surgery began his residency at Hopkins in 1971. Levi Watkins was a cardiac surgeon as well as civil rights activist who served as the first Black chief resident at Hopkins. He introduced a surgical procedure using a defibrillator, changing and enhancing the techniques for open heart surgery. And some might say equally important were Watkins' efforts at the institution to change medical education. In 1975, he helped launch a nationwide call to recruit talented minority students interested in medicine. And you'll see some of the pamphlets where his photograph and other Black doctors and Black students' photos were featured. And those are from the archives. He also founded the annual Martin Luther King Commemoration Day at Hopkins, kind of demanding that the institution recognize Black progress. Nursing is another area where we were really impacted by an incredible Black figure, Fanny Gaston Johansson. I wanted to mention her because of her research on health disparities, pain management, and also coping mechanisms for breast cancer patients. She joined the faculty at Hopkins in the 1990s for the School of Nursing, and she actually had a joint appointment with the School of Medicine. She officially became the first Black tenured full professor in 1998. So thinking about numbers and chronology too here is important. She led trainings on minority global health disparities and continued that research that would benefit patients with terminal illnesses until she retired in 2014. And there's actually there's some faculty diversity awards that are named in her honor now at the School of Nursing. So obviously, you know, kind of just taking a pause to recognize that these figures of the past have made today's present and tomorrow's future possible. In the 1960s, the campus atmosphere reflected national student movements confronting racial injustice and opposing the Vietnam War. During this transformative period, 2 Black students, John Guess and Bruce Baker, led the creation of the Black Student Organization, which was the predecessor to today's Black Student Union on Homewood campus. One of their first efforts was actually to march to the president's office with a list of 12 demands. They called for increased enrollment of Black students, suggesting that that effort continue until 10% of the student population was Black. And I would add here, I think I might have it in the next slide, that the current percentage of Black students in the student body, at least for first-year students at Homewood, I should add that caveat, is actually just 5.7%, which is a sharp decline from 13.8% in 2023. The students in 1967 asked for more Black professors. They requested the inclusion of Black literature in the curriculum. They demanded to have courses taught on Black intellectual history and Black thought. They requested a Black barber for campus. And they also requested that they have Black staff and student liaisons in the admissions office to really ramp up and push for those recruitment efforts of Black students. They demanded social programs, asking that Hopkins and Morgan State, HBCU nearby, have students meeting and possibly doing an exchange program. And they actually suggested that the university establish an interracial committee to improve race relations between the university itself and the community around them. One of the final demands was that a report be created and that any progress or things that the administration do to work towards these goals be acknowledged and written down to be shared. University administration received these demands and made some small changes, but nothing radical. And there was even a faculty member who spoke out at the time saying that Black students should not receive preferential treatment. So there was pretty bold response to, or negative response to, these demands. I would say that two of the big wins that came out of these demands and these efforts were a commitment to increase the recruitment of local Black students from Baltimore to Hopkins, and the founding and recognition of the Black Student Organization by the Student Council and the university administration. So as we see, progress has ebbed and flowed on Homewood campus in particular, which is definitely something that can be said across the entire institution. Interestingly, here in 1994, the BSO's successor, the Black Student Union, created a list of 16 issues that they presented to the university administration. And the parallels to me are pretty striking. To name just a few, these students asked for a substantial increase in numbers of Black faculty, the creation of a Black Studies department, the employment of Black academic advisors, an increase in Black student recruitment and support, and increased funding for Black student groups. These students saw the importance of supporting Black staff, and they actually called for contract workers at Hopkins to receive equal access to things like the library and the gym. In the archives, we have a progress report that's noted here that shows some of the changes or adjustments made by the university based on those demands. But it's clear that the efforts were often deemed more long-term or things to happen over years rather than immediately. As one university, Hopkins has made progress. There are more Black-led spaces and groups. There are more ways to recognize Black excellence, and there are more opportunities to share and study Black history, culture, and thought. Today, undergraduate students participate in 4 of the Divine 9 on campus. Pictured here is a session we did with Alpha Kappa Alpha, AKA this year actually is celebrating its 41st charter anniversary. They're dated back to 1984 on campus. Black faculty and staff have stepped up year after year to help recognize and create safe spaces for Black folks, with the BFSA actually celebrating its 30th year this year. And they lead important conversations with leadership, including an annual meeting with the president, where we meet with him and his team, and we can actually ask questions of them in person. Black staff created a project called The Indispensable Role of Blacks at Hopkins, which is a project that honors and recognizes Black achievement on a regular basis with inductees every year, and ceremonies honoring them and bringing their families into the fold. There's an online exhibit where you can read a brief biography of each of the inductees, and there's some exhibit panels actually featuring their portraits around campus in different buildings. I've actually had the honor of interviewing a couple of the inductees, in particular, an early Black medical student, James Davis, an early Krieger student, James Cross, as well as 3 Black women who have been working in Hopkins dining for several decades. I won't reveal their ages. I obviously can't understate the value of Black alumni, as you know, that's those are the folks who brought us to this program this evening. So, you know, huge shout out to the Society of Black Alumni and the Fred Scott Brigade for, you know, holding the torch and continuing to support Black folks at Hopkins. I showed a photograph earlier. I'll just page back for 1 second to recognize John Guest here, a Black alumni who was mentoring a student, Hadid Habib, and there is an upcoming Homewood exhibition about the 150th, about the sesquicentennial at Homewood Museum that I would encourage you to look out for. Hadid met with John, and I think it meant a lot to him to have that one-on-one time. It's very special. The university's progress is also noticeable in other ways. I should mention that in 2004, we opened a Center for Africana Studies with a dedication speech actually given by none other than Toni Morrison, which I just recently found in the archives. Shout out to Dr. Larry Jackson for helping me with that one. Students can earn a BA in Africana Studies or a minor. And I would say, from my perspective, the investment could be more for this. There's been conversations in terms of shifting the center to becoming a full department. But I will acknowledge that there's been impacts to the center because of the roadmap, with 8 faculty members actually joining in 2016. Today, as you'll see with some numbers here, there are more Black faculty members. That this is specific to faculty here, as well as staff and also women and people of color in leadership positions throughout the university. If you're interested in these statistics, they actually come out annually. So you can quick Google them online, you can page through, you can go through and see the specifics more closely. I would say that the roadmap has indeed helped, but it's also established the continued recognition that we can and will do better. I'd offer one closing thought, that for Black students, staff, faculty, and their allies, there's still so much to be fighting for. We must continue to make demands of the university as a collective and unified force. I remain grateful that our students lead the way. In recent years, they've protested the private police. They've confronted the ramifications of the repeal of affirmative action, and they've continuously demanded that the university administration address issues of discrimination on campus. So Black students are no longer, as historian Hugh Hawkins once called them at Hopkins, quote, the uninvited. They're indispensable to our institution. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to John to kick off our panel discussion.
Make sure I'm not on mute. Thank you so much, Allison. I'm sure we have a few audience questions and comments, so we'd love for you to stay on for our Q&A at the end of the event. However, now I'm anxious to loop in our illustrious panelists now. I'd like to start by asking each of you to please share a little bit about your background and your journey to Hopkins. The order will be Dr. Lindsai Bland, engineering class of 2012, followed by Dr. Leslie Farrington, arts and sciences class of 76. Then Dr. LaMarr Darnell Shields, education class of 2014. Dr. Deneen Hendrick, arts and sciences class of 86. And Mr. Wilbur Wright, SAIS class of 61. Lindsay, why don't you start us off?
Good evening. I'm Lindsai Bland, a graduate of the Wright School of Engineering in 2012. My start with Hopkins actually was in the 90s as a child, following my mom along to her classes for her second master's degree, as she took them at one of the satellite campuses in Montgomery County, Maryland. I guess my quote unquote return to Hopkins was in 2008 as a graduate student working on my master's in applied physics. I did not do Hopkins undergrad. I actually am a graduate of Spelman College, and I started at Hopkins as a working student in the Wright School of Engineering. Currently, I work at NASA with the Space Communications and Navigation Division, working as a mission operations interface lead for all missions as they use NASA's networks. That's my quick spiel.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Leslie Farrington, the floor is yours.
I'm a retired obstetrician gynecologist from New York City. I got my BA at Hopkins in '76, majoring in the humanities. I was recruited by Leslie King Hammond, who was getting her PhD in art history at the time. Her mother, Evelyn, and my mother, Joan, worked together as nurses. So that's how I wound up at Hopkins in 1971, when they had just started admitting women to live on campus. The previous year, they were commuting. I got my MD at Howard University College of Medicine in 1984. Between 1973 and 1979, I gave birth to 3 daughters. My second career is to improve Black maternal health because we have a serious urgency to address the racism impacting the lives of Black mothers and babies. I began working on the Act for Safe Motherhood initiative in 2016, and in 2020, I co-founded the Black Coalition for Safe Motherhood to promote the ACT curriculum in Black communities across the African diaspora. ACT stands for self-affirming and potentially life-saving steps to take charge of one's care and mitigate discrimination. ACT stands for Ask Questions Until You Understand the Answers, Claim Your Space, both physical and mental, Trust Your Body, and Tell Your Story. And I have to mention 3 important facts about the crisis in obstetric outcomes. 1, discrimination is a contributing factor in 30% of maternal deaths in the United States. 2, over 80% of the deaths are preventable. And thirdly, the numbers of pregnancy-related deaths in 2023 have declined for all ethnicities except for Black mothers. So this is an SOS situation for Black families. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farrington. Next up, we have, where'd you go? Dr. LaMarr Darnell Shields.
First, I would just want to thank Allison just for your great research and sharing the beauty of Blackness on the campus. It's an honor just to be here with all of you all today. Anytime I get a chance to share space, stories, and ideas with people who care about community and change, I don't take it lightly. These days, I got my hands in a lot of things, but truth is that they all connect. I'm the CEO of the Cambio Group. For those who speak Spanish, Cambio means change, where we help schools, nonprofits, and organizations deal with some of the challenges that may take place on campuses like Hopkins. That work really grew out of my own work and research through a book that I wrote called What I Learned in the Midst of Chaos, The Making of an Ubuntu Teacher. Back then, I was just trying to make sense of the chaos in the classrooms and in life. And then I discovered that teaching was the department that I come from out at Hopkins, and really teaching communication that was connected. That commitment to community has always been a part of my story. While I was a graduate student and later a faculty member at Johns Hopkins, I co-founded the Paul Robeson Academy, an all-male, I'm so proud of it, an all-male Saturday program right on the campus of Johns Hopkins in the School of Education, where we built it as a space where young Black and brown boys could see themselves reflected as the history that was just shared earlier in spaces and prepare them for the future. Today, my work is connected in Baltimore through the Baltimore Rights to Passion Initiative, where it's an extension of the work that we started at Johns Hopkins. Writing, researching, the work has not changed. So if someone asked me, what are you doing right now? I'd say I'm still learning, still creating. Just like Lindsay, I went to Grambling State University before I ended up at Hopkins, at Loyola, at school in Mexico. And I think Sean Bland is your big brother who was a student of mine while at Johns Hopkins, and he was one of the teachers at the Praise Academy. And so I'm excited just to be in a space with some amazing people here. So thank you for the opportunity.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Shields. Next up is Dr. Deneen Hendrick.
Good evening, everyone. And again, my thanks for being here. My thanks to my friend Elena Thompson, who thinks that I'm wonderful. I'm not quite sure how I got in this mix, but I'm happy to be here. Allison, my thanks to you for that lovely presentation. And I was quite excited because my picture was actually in there. So I think a couple of years ago at reunion weekend, you all had an event, and I shrieked when I walked in because I saw pictures of me. And so that was just exciting. So I am not from Baltimore. I am actually from North Jersey, Bergen County, Teaneck to be specific. Proud to be from North Jersey. And found my way to Hopkins simply because I wanted to become a doctor. And so I was very specific in the schools I applied to. Obviously, Hopkins made the cut. If I'm being transparent, I actually did not. I wanted to go to Penn because I thought I would have a better experience at Penn, but sometimes God knows what you need and you need best. And I wound up at Hopkins. And as it turns out, it turned out to be a great decision for me, as I was able to immerse myself in a lot of stuff and to stay community engaged all these years later. I'm a pediatrician by training. I've been to medical school, but the road has kind of shifted, and I'm now on the academic side, training medical students and preparing pre-meds and trying to mentor. There's a lot of help that's needed because pre-meds don't know what they don't know. And so you find that there are always pockets for people to give information. And so I'm doing that work now, teaching and mentoring and advising one of the medical groups. If any of you are in medical world, you've heard of SNMA. So I advise an SNMA chapter, and that work is taking me in some direction. So I got my hands in a lot of pots, but I've managed to stay engaged with Hopkins, good, bad, or otherwise. I remember the foundings of SOBA that started during my time. And so I've been actively engaged with that group since it was originally founded. And again, just happy to be here to listen to everyone and to contribute from my perspective. What things I think that Hopkins has done well, and then probably some areas where we may still need to work. So thanks for having me.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. And last but not least is Mr. Wilbur Wright. The floor is yours.
Thank you. My story is a little different. I'm a retired American diplomat. I attended Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, which you may or may not know is in Washington, D.C. So I'm not really very familiar with the campus in Baltimore. I was born and grew up in Detroit, attended the public schools there. I attended a junior college, was very active in student government and in church activities. And in that context, I became chairman of the United Nations Day program about 1951. And I met the speaker for our program, was Marie Kohlberger, who was a member of the United States delegation to the United Nations. She came to Detroit, and in the car, she asked me who I was and what I was about. And I said that I was getting out of architecture and out of engineering and going into political science. She asked what I expected to do with that. And I thought, well, law school. She asked, had I ever thought about foreign service? Had I ever heard of it? I said, indeed, I had. I had read a book entitled Red Star Over China about foreign service officers in China during World War II. Well, through her began a correspondence that went on for about 5 years that led ultimately to SAIS. Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies originally was just the School of Advanced International Studies, created by a group of dissident professors who were at the Fletcher School of Tufts. And they decided at the end of World War II that they should move to Washington, where the action was. There was a split in the faculty, and so the group the dissenting group, moved to Washington and founded the School of Advanced International Studies, and ultimately developed a relationship with Johns Hopkins. When I entered SAIS in 1959, there were 100 students enrolling, and 4 of whom were Black. All 4 were men. All 4 of us graduated. Of the 100 students who enrolled, only about 90 graduated. I went on to work first in the International Bureau of the Labor Department, and then into the State Department, and spent most of my time in the State Department overseas. I became what some people call an Arabist. I studied Arabic, Islam, and the history and culture of the Middle East. And I was selected for a particular job at a particular time in Cairo, which turned out to be, for me, fortuitous, because I was there during a critical turning point in Middle Eastern history for the 6-Day War. And during that time, we also established a relationship with the man who became the president of Egypt and led the shift away from Soviet influence and squarely into the camp of the United States, that is Anwar Sadat. But after my time in Cairo, I went on an assignment to the embassy in Rome, and from there came back to the United States and then to Morocco. And following Morocco, I went back to Italy in Florence, and then to The Hague and Brussels. It has been a rocky path. As I mentioned, there are only 4 out of 100 students who were Black entering SAIS in 1959. But in some ways, that didn't strike me as particularly unusual. I was undergraduate at the University of Michigan. And at the time that I was at Michigan, it didn't strike me as unusual that Blacks were such a small minority, because I later learned of the 33,000 students on campus in Ann Arbor, only 150, including the law and medical schools, were Black. So as it happens, and I had attended really integrated schools as it happens in Detroit. The elementary school I enrolled in was about 30% white when I started, but all Black when I graduated. And then I went to intermediate school and then to a technical high school where Blacks typically were about 5 to 10% of the student population. This, recall, was in the 50s, and student activism was at a very low level. After I retired from the State Department in 1985, and since then I have I started my own company importing, wholesaling educational toys from the Netherlands. I closed the company after 5 years and went to work for an organization called the Moral Rearmament as executive director for a summer seminar we ran overseas in Switzerland on conflict resolution. And from there, I went to, I left there after about 4 years and went to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting as a special assistant to the president on reform and restructuring. That adventure ended when Newt Gingrich was elected and promised to cut all funds for public broadcasting. So then I went to Mount Vernon College and I taught there for a year until my wife succumbed to brain cancer. And I took off a couple of months to sort of travel and regroup. Sometime later, a friend asked me to help him with his mortgage program. So I worked as a mortgage loan officer. And then I was asked by my friends from Detroit to help them with their government relations. So I became a kind of lobbyist for the Ford Motor Minority Dealers Association, and later the NAMAD, National Association of All Minority Dealers.
Mr. Wright.
Yes.
You touched on it, so I want to get a little deeper into what was it like to be a member of the Hopkins community at the time in history when you were one of 4 in a class of 100 people? What was that like at that time?
Well, from my perspective, it's not totally unusual because I had spent all my life in education as a minority. I had gotten married and I was not living in town. SAIS at that time, might be of interest to you, was 3 mansions at 19th and Florida Avenue in Washington. So there was not a central location, but because I had been in the Army and I'd been saving up to go to college, I brought my lunches to school, and I had lunch in one of the very large dining rooms with the large leather-bound chairs, eating my sandwiches. When other students came in, wondered who I was and asked questions. It turned out to be a very interesting exchange because most of them had come out of Northeastern colleges and from very privileged backgrounds. Most of them had never met anyone who actually worked. When I explained that I had worked in the auto assembly lines at DeSoto and also at Lincoln Mercury, and that I had been a janitor and done a whole wide range of tasks, they wanted to know in detail what it was like to work and to try and match the income with the bills that were coming in. So in some ways it was educational for me. I had never imagined anybody could be that ignorant of what it was like to make a living, to try and match your income with the expenses.
Over that course, did that dynamic change? That must have been in the beginning of your journey, but towards your graduation, do you think your educational experience was different than your peers, or do you think it was the same?
It was very different. As I mentioned, most of them had never worked. And some of the changes in their lives are quite startling. One guy who was in particular interested in my background because during World War II, I had a brother in the Army Air Corps, and he gave me a book on the Army Air Corps, and it contained the stories of all people in the Army Air Corps who had won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Colonel Demas Craw. And I met this new student, and I was asked if he perchance knew of who was Demas Craw. It turned out it was his father. And he loved and adored his father, idolized his father. And he became a friend. He always spoke to me, although his mother had remarried, and his stepfather at the time we were at SAIS was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Radford. So Nicky Craw was very well connected. I was startled some years later, about 3 years later, when Nixon became president, that Nicky Craw, who had never worked, had no idea what work was like, was appointed head of VISTA when Nixon combined the Peace Corps and all the volunteer activities under one umbrella, under the charge of someone who had no idea what it was like to work. But it was an interesting experience to meet people like that. And I think I found it interesting to meet somebody who had worked.
Understood. Let's get someone else in here. Anyone else want to share what it was like to be part of the Hopkins community at the time you started in history?
I can jump in. To be honest, it was a little complicated for me. I think I heard Lindsay talk about the school she attended undergrad. There was pride. It was pride being at Hopkins, no question about it. But, Hopkins is one of the best institutions. I'm originally from Chicago, so I knew about Hopkins. I knew about Dr. Ben Carson. He was right next door, being from Detroit. But coming from Grambling State University in Louisiana, I couldn't help but feel the difference. Of course, at Grambling, I felt I was more surrounded by people who looked like me, who talk like me, who dance like me, even though folks are from different places. And I always tell people, we talk about HBCUs not being culturally diverse. Let me just tell you, DC and Baltimore is culturally diverse. We can start there. From go-go music to mumbo sauce to dancing. If you don't know why that's funny, Google that. We don't have time for that. But as a student, and I was as an undergraduate student through a program called Teach for America. That's how I got in. I felt somewhat a little isolated, but as a faculty member, more so, I sometimes felt the responsibility of being like the only one in the room. It's very different from being on the main campus. So my non-Black peers, for the most part, didn't have to sort of carry that. I always tell people, my mentor was Dr. Freeman Rabowski, who was the president of the UMBC. And I would always tell them the funny story. that, you know, on Hopkins, I walked a certain way, but when I got off the campus, my confidence went to a little bop. It's almost like if you ever see Barack Obama, when he sees Michelle Obama, it's very different from when he's meeting with the czar of another country. Some of you all will figure that out later on. But for me, my presence was never neutral. It always carried history and expectation. And that's a lot of weight. But it also pushed me into grow, to persist, and to think about how to make sure others didn't feel the same sense of aloneness. And so when I saw that Black and brown student, I grew up speaking Spanish. So when I saw somebody, a Latino person, and when I saw a person of color, when I saw in particular a male student, and not saying I don't have an affinity for other kids, but it was something about running into a Black male student on the campus, telling them to hold their head up, that level of confidence, and explain to them that they too, like I had to somewhat code switch. And so there were some challenges, but you know, I come from a very hard city, and I was used to ebbing and flowing with the language, bilingual, sometimes trilingual, but quite often being a faculty person there, you know, carried a little bit of weight. And that's why listening to, you know, Allison, when she talked about some of the great people of color in there, I could not help but think about my good friend, Dr. Conley, you know, in 2016, you know, the first African-American U.S. historian to gain a tenure at Hopkins. And then for me to rub shoulders with him in other places. So, you know, my isolation might have felt somewhat different than Brother Wright's did, but it was there. But because I came from a strong place, a strong city, I was able to walk with that confidence and then pour into other males that look like me on the campus.
Thank you, Dr. Shields. As you can see, the water is warm. Does anyone else want to weigh in before we pivot on to the next question?
I'll weigh in. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Thank you. And just to piggyback off the Dr. Shields there, you know, I came from an HBCU, started working and then went to Hopkins. I went to Spelman College. So not only an HBCU, but an all women's college. If I'm sure many are aware, there's not that many Black women in physics. So the isolation and being the only one was not only going to be a part of my experience at Hopkins, was going to be a part of my experience in my future, in my career. So I will say, coming from a place that is determined to not only train, but invest in Black women, in their success, in their maturity, in their abilities and their choices, to then go into Hopkins, I felt secure. Do you feel alone? Yes, but I did feel secure in my background. I will say, as a working student, there's a different perspective. I was not on Hopkins campus. I was at the Applied Physics Laboratory. So there's a different, I think, feeling or a vibe, you might say, about what's going on there. We're doing the research, we're doing a different type of study. But I will say there's a shift that does occur from coming from a Black space into a predominantly white space.
Dr. Hendricks?
I might say that the atmosphere in the early 50s into 59 was quite different, but it caught up with us. In the State Department in 1972, I was in Washington on assignment, and I was one of a group of 10 Black officers in the Foreign Affairs organizations who formed something called the Thursday Luncheon Group. My point of view is we primarily needed to be able to identify our friends and enemies, because there are many ways in the Foreign Service and Foreign Service organizations like USAA and AID for people to ruin your career and ruin your life without you ever knowing it. And there are also people who want to help you, but they don't necessarily want to be identified as a crusader. So I felt it was important for us to be able to identify our friends and our enemies. And so that was the idea behind forming the TLG, the Thursday Luncheon Group.
Very nice.
To my astonishment, we just celebrated, TLG just celebrated its 50th anniversary 2 years ago in the Secretary of State's dining room with Secretary Blinken in attendance. So
Very
it's had
nice.
a great success there. There were only, I think, 10 of us who formed the TLG back in 1972, and I think their membership is somewhere around 400, including all foreign organizations, AID, SAIS, Commerce, Department of Labor, and so on.
Okay. Dr. Farrington or Dr. Hendrick, did you want to weigh in before we move to the next
I
question?
did, but if I'll let her go first and then I'll go. So I didn't know what Dr. Farrington wanted to say.
Okay, I'll make mine shorter. The number of Hopkins, the number of Black students at the Hop was very small in the early 70s. So we were like a big family, and Leslie King, who had recruited me, she was our big sister. And at that time, it was it was really like a family, and everyone knew everybody. We were from diverse backgrounds. There were a few cliques, and there was some colorism, but I made friends with everyone. And I had left home early because it was pretty lonely to be a white presenting Black kid who everybody told you're not Black. But I enjoyed a rich social life within a community of undergraduate and graduate students. And remember, it was a new thing for them to accept Black students in slightly more significant numbers, so there wasn't only 1 or 2 per year. So, so for me, as a 16-year-old freshman, it was quite a rich experience. Leslie King Hammond, she is now a renowned art historian, she recommended me to be on this panel. And as I mentioned, she also invited me to apply to Hopkins back in 1970. So this is a full circle moment. It's a 55-year-old circle. So, I really appreciate being here. And I would say we had a very rich cultural experience with students like Gil Scott Heron, Leslie King. We had quite, I don't believe white students could have had as culturally rich an experience as we did in the Black community at JHU in the 70s. Many of us were from Baltimore high schools at that point, like my best friend, Gail Williams, who was in one of those pictures. She's still my best friend, and I remain close to my family by marriage and my friends in Baltimore. In fact, I'll be coming down for the Fred Scott Brigade dinner in a few weeks.
Very nice.
So,
All right,
so
Dr. Hendrick?
yes, so I was going to add a couple of things, something to what Dr. Shields said. I grew up in diversity. My high school was diverse. The town I grew up in was very diverse. So it gave me, I think, a slightly different perspective. And maybe I was able to navigate a little differently. I did have friends and that were there that came out of all Black settings. And to some degree, some of them maybe struggled a bit because they had never seen the opposite. So we always hear of a Black student coming into an all-white environment, somebody being in an all-white environment, but they were in all Black environments where there was Black schools, Black high schools. And so some of them found Hopkins a little challenging to navigate. So I will say there was some of that. But Hopkins must have been doing at that time a lot of recruiting, because I believe my class we entered in 82. At that time, we were had the most Black students, somewhere in the 60s, I think, in terms of, so to Dr. Farrington's point, they were doing some work, I guess, into getting students. And so we had a very rich experience because the numbers weren't large, but they were larger. And so we built on a lot of the stuff that had been started, the students in the 70s. The BSU became a big part of things. Other student groups, the gospel choir, those things got started when I was there. And so it made for a very rich experience. Hopkins, I always tell people I'm fortunate because I went to school with very smart people, but they were some of the hippest. And again, back to what Dr. Shields said, they were just cool people. Dr. Robert Wilson, Bob Clayton, I could rattle them off. Dr. Harvey, he's down in North Carolina. They were smart, but they were cool. And so we kind of had both the best of both worlds, if you could, really, really gifted and smart kids, but who also, to take Dr. Shields' comment, had a little bop to them. And so that was a great experience for us, especially for someone like me coming out of high school very shy. And I'm very close to some of those folks to this day. So it was a very interesting time. And as I said, at that period of Hopkins, we did not have a lot of the groups that we had today. So the BSU was really kind of home central. And we had some students who did not find themselves part of for whatever reasons, but for the most part, we supported everybody and everything. If you were there, and I didn't know anything about lacrosse, but we went to games because one of the upperclassmen was what played lacrosse. And so we went to support that effort. So there was a lot of cohesiveness that we found. Dr. Farrington mentioned we had Kwame Ture. He was Stokely Carmichael. Kwame Ture came to campus. We had a lot of different cultural experiences that we were able to navigate. So it was a very interesting time. Again, yeah, you're in this white environment and you kind of know that maybe people aren't necessarily rooting for you, but we found community and family. And that's probably the reason that a lot of us were able to get out. So just all of those things, just kind of, as they were talking, I was like, wow. But Hopkins did a great job at that time. I don't know how things changed after that. But they were recruiting heavily at that time because, like I said, I think there were 60 plus. There might have been 70 plus of us in my class. And at that time, it was a big deal because I think we were the biggest class to date. They've probably had classes that have had more since then. But at that time, and Hopkins was smaller. They now overall take more people. But at that time, I think Hopkins was still between 3,000 and 4,000 students at that time. It was not 6,000 or whatever it is now. So anyway, that's just perspective. But again, it was community, it was family. And we really tried to support and help one another.
So Dr. Hendrick, you touched on this, so I'll put this out to the panel. Are there elements that you noticed about the institution, the community, or the campus culture that are different from your time at Hopkins? Would you say that they are better, the same, or different? And I'll leave it open to whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll say this briefly. I think some things are better. I think some things maybe are not better. I think anytime you have progress and you get more of something, now there are more things to kind of, and I see this with the medical students, right? There are more things to engage your time. So a lot of these groups now, I don't even recognize because we didn't have them back then. So now you've got groups and now people's time is sort of splintered, right? So now you have to sort of pick. The BSU for us was home central. And even though the sorority Alpha Kappa Alpha was started and I'm a charter member, we still only had a handful of things that we were engaged. Some people played sports, like classmates who played football and basketball, but we did not have a lot of the other student groups. So I think in some regards, that progress is good. It gives people more options, but in some ways it's maybe pulled people away from the overall support. The other thing I will say is good is Hopkins, we made our own fun. Hopkins was not very student-centric, but now they have all kinds of things, student centers. And when I go back, I'm amazed at the resources and things that students have that we did not have, even in terms of educational resources to help them be successful. So I will say they have been successful on that part. I think in some other ways, maybe we have not moved as far. And that's because, again, I think now students have to study. And if you got to pick, you don't have all of this time to be here and be here and be here and be there. And so I see that sometimes as I talk to students or as I go to different things, that maybe students aren't as engaged with, like I said, BSU and some of the other things. Some are, but a lot aren't. So I would say those would be my answers to what has changed, what's good, and maybe what hasn't been as good.
I'll jump in. I think what really impressed me, well, let me just go back. Dr. Hendrick talked about all those great people that were there. I think so many college campuses now are afraid to have those speakers. And I think that's the thing that students are missing. They're missing these radical thinkers, like you mentioned, Gil Scott-Heron, and you also mentioned Kwame Ture. It's just unfortunate those college students don't really get that anymore, to hear different perspectives. But what I will say that's changing, and I was really excited about at Johns Hopkins, is that they're really focusing a lot on students being socially responsible. There's a department, my buddy used to head the department. We partnered with them when we were running the Paul Robeson Academy there, where they were asking students they were really looking, because we know Hopkins students are brilliant. To come to that school, you just gotta be sharp. And so what I was discovering on many of the applications, John, they were asking students about, are you socially engaged in high school? What are some of the things that you're doing? They want to become this socially responsible campus. And I thought that was revolutionary, to really look for those type of students. Because again, when I worked for, Lindsay, your brother was a scholar through this. We talk about the Gates Millennium Scholars Program. I was a reader for the Gates Scholarship for years. And one of the things I loved about it, we knew these kids were brilliant. We knew these students were brilliant, but we were really looking for a well-rounded kid. We were looking for students who not only just were able to be academically aligned with what Hopkins and other schools were looking for, but we wanted students who were being socially responsible and conscious. And I know when I was there, 2014, maybe to 20, I can't think, when we wrapped up our time there, Hopkins was really looking for those students who were really concerned about issues that were, environment issues, medical issues, and just out, not just discovering diseases, but how can you engage people in the community that are being affected by some of these things. So I was really excited about that, and that department grew. I just can't think of the name of it right now, but I know that they were really looking for those type of students when they were competing. Because again, you're applying to get into the school, and you have a great GPA, and you have a great GPA. And now we're leaning toward people who have great GPAs, but who are also concerned about what's going on in the world. And I was really excited about that.
Interesting perspective. All right, Dr. Farrington, do you have anything you'd like to add to this? Fair enough.
I would say something.
I don't have much experience to the campus at this point in time.
You're talking about primarily in the medical field on campus. The situation for me, of course, is quite different, because we're, first of all, in Washington, although the Carey School and the SAIS are in the same building. My feelings about going into foreign affairs right now is kind of mixed, because the primary employer of people working in that field is in government, and many of them are being thrown out. But I think it perhaps, in a sense, is more important than ever that we study foreign affairs, because they're going to need people who have knowledge of foreign countries, foreign languages, and have had some familiarity with traveling abroad, in order to get the country back on the track of reason and wisdom after all of this passes. So there are the number of Black students at SAIS is very small, maybe 3 or 4 out of over 100. So in some ways, this is a kind of a dark time. We never really had enough to form an organization at SAIS.
Understood. Well, Dr. Farrington, you shared with us earlier that you were coming into town. So how else do you stay connected to this place? And why are those your points of connectivity, and what importance are that about those connections to you?
The family that was formed at Hopkins in the late 60s and 70s has stayed together. And you mentioned this, that was thanks to the Fred Scott Brigade dinners that are held yearly since 1993. And our dinner host for life, he calls himself, is Michael David Smith, who was a graduate student in political science in the 70s. Mike was and still is my big brother. And he really has been instrumental in nurturing our family bonds and expanding our circle to include Black alumni from other eras, Black faculty, staff, and current students. In fact, I don't know if we didn't show it, but there's a picture, one of my pictures is of Governor Wes Moore attending one of our dinners. Professor Lester Spence spoke at one of our dinners a while back, and I still follow the politics in Baltimore and nationally through his writing. Recently, I read Professor Martha Jones' book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. So our faculty is keeping, the faculty is keeping me involved, the Black faculty at Hopkins. And my life is still enriched by the connections made over 50 years ago. In fact, Leslie King Hammond is the curator of a major exhibition of the art of John Wilson, which opens next week at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Last year, she asked me to write an essay about Wilson's portrayal of a lynching witnessed by a terrified Black mother holding her baby tightly. And Leslie knew, because she's followed my work, she knew I would compare the terrorism in Wilson's painting to the ongoing impact of white supremacy on Black maternal health. And my essay was just published along with others in a book celebrating Wilson's work, which is edited. The book is edited by Leslie King Hammond. And next week, Leslie and I get to enjoy a red carpet moment at the Met at the opening of this exhibition. So I can't, that it's basically being part of the Black community at Hopkins that has really influenced my life. Well, of course, having a baby during my junior year that was caught by a midwife at Hopkins Hospital, a student midwife, that also influenced my life going forward as well. And because of her, I decided to become an obstetrician.
Oh, look at that. Little jewels you're dropping on us tonight.
If I could jump in, I have
Sure.
a slightly different connectivity point. Not being on main campus and being a working student, you don't have as many opportunities to develop the closest peer-to-peer relationship. But in actuality, with my work at Goddard Space Flight Center at the time, NASA, Goddard, and Hopkins APL have an incredible partnership and programs where they do spacecraft flight operations. And forgive me, because I'm going to nerd out for a quick second, but a lot of my connectivity, even to this day, is in doing direct work with APL and their flight operations programs. I just sat in on a key decision point meeting for the Carruthers spacecraft, which will be launching the end of September, which will be operated out of APL. So it's, for me, maintaining that connectivity comes directly from the work that I do, whether it's at headquarters now in my new role or in my previous role at Goddard Space Flight Center. So I appreciate the ability to reach back into Hopkins and into the knowledge that was built there, and to the staff and the faculty and all the people at APL. That to me has always been extremely impressive and made an impact. I look for those partnerships as much as possible in my work.
Dr. Shields, you got anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you nailed it. I mean, I think, I'm looking at a couple of the questions in the chat. I think what's important, because I'm always thinking about the next generation. My friend Calvin Wise, I think he is still in position of administrative officer. So, in recruiting students to come to the campus, the Baltimore Scholars Program, which is amazing. I taught at Baltimore City College High School. I think what's important is forums like this are important for Black and brown students to see and hear these stories, the beautiful parts of those stories and the challenges, because the only way our young people can be something is if they see it and if they can touch it. This is a generation that needs to see it and they needs to touch it. When I tell people, being a student, being a faculty at Hopkins, you know, the eyebrows go up because not being from here, I don't know the Hopkins story. Black folks has an issue with Hopkins. Just be real clear, from the college to the hospital. But I didn't come in with that story. So I was able to shift the narrative, and being a historian like Allison is sharing, even though I'm a student of history, and I'm not saying I don't buy into the story, but I wanted to, as a storyteller, I'm constantly shifting the narrative, giving young people an opportunity to see this campus with their own eyes. When we started our Saturday school at Johns Hopkins, again, we're on a college campus. We got black and brown middle school and high school boys being on a campus, getting an opportunity. I think Dr. Hendrick talked about, she mentioned some Black scholars that was there coming to speak to our students. So I think the important part of those individuals that are listening is really having people hear your story, being very transparent about your story, but then also sharing the beauty of the lessons that you learn on that campus. That is the power of storytelling. That is the power of people hearing our voices, because again, there has to be a counter narrative of what's happening on these campuses. We have to share those stories. And that's what I'm constantly doing. As someone who works out at Hopkins to this day, as someone who's in the bleachers running those steps every day, looking at the shades of the students getting darker and darker, it's beautiful to me, because when I was there, and I'm not talking about from the sun either, I'm talking about folks with melanin in their skin walking on those campuses, and then me sharing my story, because again, as I read, there's some students who, John, don't feel comfortable when they go into the gym. There's been articles about Black and Latino kids who come in, and white kids come into the campus and they're not asking for IDs. They're not, and so me taking my students there, saying, this is the world that we live in. It doesn't change. People, eyebrows going up. Oh, you a Dr. Shields? Oh, because I'm wearing Timberlands and Adidas or jeans. So the story and the struggle continues, is how we sort of carry that. So I'm grateful that you all are sharing stories, but the folks that are listening, and the folks that are listening in live, and the folks that are listening later on, it's so important to elevate and share these stories about the beautiful parts that are actually there.
An interesting footnote I'd like to draw your attention to. You may know that the new building that Hopkins has in Washington for the School of Advanced International Studies and the Carey School of Business, the Bloomberg building, in the entry off Pennsylvania Avenue, there's an enormous artwork about 6 feet by 5 feet. It's by Sam Gilliam, who is an African-American painter. I think many consider the preeminent abstract painter for the late 20th century. Sam and I were in the same unit in the Army in Japan together. So I've witnessed his evolution, and I'm delighted to see that painting. I think there may be a connection, because I think the Phillips Gallery curator to whom I introduced him was partly responsible for introducing Sam to the modern art scene in Washington when he first moved here, with his wife, who was the first Black journalist at the Washington Post.
Very nice. Dr. Hendricks, why don't you bring us home? So as we reflect on the first 150 years, what are your hopes for this next chapter for the institution?
Oh, that's a big question. I think I'm gonna answer this a couple ways. I think that a lot will be determined by how scared, I'm going to use the word scared, in the current climate we live in. I think the question will be, what kind of courage does the institution and the people connected to it have to move forward? If you are in any element, I don't work at Hopkins, but if you are in education or DEI, particularly any element of higher ed, we see what is happening, and we see, you know, and I get it because people need to make livings, but sometimes people choose the space of comfort. And so I think I'm going to say, what is the courage that we have to say, this is not what we want to model for the institution? And so seeing some of the progress that we talked about earlier in terms of recruiting, even going back to scholarships and the Vivian Thomas Scholars. I met several of them last year or a couple of years ago at one of the events, and recruiting in Baltimore City and partnering more with Baltimore City. Are we going to be able to sustain that? So are we going to make a choice for community, or are we just going to go into our silos and decide? And so I think that's really the question that needs to be answered to help us decide how we want to move forward. The other thing I will say, and someone touched on it, is there was a question and I'll kind of touch on it in the Q&A about how do we engage people. And Elena knows, because I've talked about this whenever I'm on a sober meeting, I beat this all the time and people get tired of me. But how do we value and give value to everyone, right? Not just the people who can give big bucks, and I get marketing and branding, but there's so many gifts out there that can be used. And so the question is, how do we engage those people? Anybody who knows me and later, I jump into stuff. So I'm one of those, oh, that sounds interesting. And then I guess people see you do good work, and then you keep getting invited back. And so my 40th reunion is next year. I've been on every reunion committee every 5 years since I got out of Hopkins. Now, I don't know if that's just because I'm exuberant in general, or whether they just wanted representation and say, oh, we'll take the Black lady and put her on there. But I'm one of those, as I like to say, be careful if you invite me, because I'll probably show up. And then once I show up, then hopefully you see me and engage. So, I'm gonna kind of say I really don't know. I'm hopeful, but I think a lot of it will have to do again with how courageous are we, and what are we willing to risk? Are we willing to call the bluff? And I'm not saying you risk the whole institution. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think that there is opportunity to stay strong and be on the side of right, and then decide if that's where you want to be. And that may cost you something. But I would argue that what you will get in return in terms of people staying engaged and feeling valued and validated will be far worth maybe some of what you might have lost. That's probably not the answer people were looking for, but that's sort of how I'm looking at that. So there you go.
John, I would like to jump in if I may. First of all, Dr. Hendrick, my favorite word is courageous. All right, that is one of my favorite words, and my hope is that Hopkins continues to move from access to belonging. I wrote an article recently about the difference, the difference between belonging and fitting in. And so my hope is that Hopkins continues to move from access to belonging, that it becomes a place where African-American students don't just survive, but they thrive. That Latino students, African-American students, first-generation students, anyone who shows up with culture, who shows up with language and lived experience, can bring their whole selves into the community without having to check any part of who they are at the door. And then I hope that the institution continues to invest in programs that support African-American students. And ultimately, I hope that the next 150 years of Hopkins are remembered, not as a time when students of color had to fight to be included, but as a time when they were recognized as central to life, identity, and brilliance of this great university.
All right. Unfortunately, we got to put a pin in it right there in the absence of time. So I want to make sure we leave at least a little time for the Q&A. But this was a wonderful conversation. I'm sure we could continue to go another hour or two, obviously by the feedback. But I'd love to turn things over to our audience now and to see what questions they have been coming in. As always, I encourage those of you watching live to continue to pose questions through the chat below. We'll do our best to respond to as many questions as we can in the time we have left. So let's go pick a first question that I will throw out to the group. And some of these I don't think we can tackle in the time we have left, so I'll try to pick a good one. Here's one. How can students be exposed to the real drivers of social change that last beyond their time as an undergraduate at the school? So I think this question implies is, I think Dr. Shields talked about they don't get to hear other voices, but as your mind is being shaped through this undergraduate experience, it's also going to drive how you move beyond the campus, right? So how do people get to the perspectives that you all have shared tonight by your experiences if other experiences are blocked from them? So how can they tap into the community to get those jewels, those nuggets that you all are sharing tonight?
And I might kick this one off. I struggle a little bit with this question because you're saying beyond their time as an undergrad. And I will say that while you are an undergraduate in Hopkins, to take advantage of the community that is around you, get off that campus and go into Baltimore, go into the rest of Maryland, go to some other college campuses around you. You have a wealth of them around you, to experience not only change of scenery, but change of thought, to see people that look like you, don't look like you, have lived like you, and have not lived like you, and be in those areas. I want to piggyback off of Dr. Hendrick's. Courage is extremely important. I hope that especially alumni in this time of, quite frankly, anti-intellectualism, that alumni take the helm of protecting students, of protecting those who are right now attempting to get their education, and creating an environment for them that they, in their big jobs and in their adult lives, will take the time to speak truth to power so that institutions can still exist and thrive. But for me, the biggest way you can do social change, the first thing you can do about social change beyond your time as an undergrad, is to make sure you are involved in the community that's right outside of your gates.
Thank you. Dr. Shields, I got a question for you since you talked about your middle and high school students. This is more about the current students at the campus. How do you think the university can get more of the Black alumni population to bring their talents and time to the current students and to the Black Hopkins community in general? You're on mute.
That is a simple answer, and I'm not even going to intellectualize. Invite them. Ask them to come back. We assume that we want to be, we have these assumptions all the time. And I think the invitation is so important. There's brilliance that have come off that campus that are still there. But I think just inviting them and saying, hey, we want you to come back. And we're not just talking about the Divine Nine. We're not talking about just a happy hour, a social hour. We're saying invite them back and share their brilliance. When we had the opportunity to have our Saturday school on that campus, that's what we did. We invited students to stay connected to things, as Lindsay said, that's bigger than the classroom. So the first part is just picking up the phone, sending an email and say, we're observing what you're doing, and invite them back. One of the things that at Grambling State University did recently, I'm proud to be a graduate. They did, it was called the Distinguished Grads. And these weren't people who were, breaking the sound barrier. They weren't the discoverers of ChatGPT or they were regular people that were doing some phenomenal things that people needed to know who it existed. And when they invited us back, you know what happened? When we came back, we invested more dollars. We all started investing our dollars because we felt that the school cared about us. What did we do? We started engaging other students there virtually and in person. So, and it all starts with an invitation. I mean, when you go to the movie Sinners, you know what Sinners was. When you invite those people in there, you got to be careful what you're inviting in there. But it all starts with an invitation. And if we don't get the invitation, most of the time we just won't show up.
I agree so much with Dr. Shields on that. So much. We love to be asked. We love somebody just to say, hey, Lindsay, you do something at NASA. I don't know what it is, but can you come talk to the kids about, whatever it is that you do there? We love to be asked. And being asked means I'm going to show up. I'm going to show up at my best. I might show up with a check. That's the key. It's we all want to take part into it. Continue to ask, continue to send the emails out. I'll tell you, the Wright School of Engineering sends stuff every week. They're good about it, but continue to push because, oh yeah, we'll show up. Just gotta be asked.
I've offered my card. I've given cards out to students at the Fred Scott Brigade dinners. And, because they express interest, but they don't follow up. Yeah. But I do encourage, and I do bring cards to give to the students because thinking about becoming a physician, they need to hear from other, those who have sort of walked that path before them.
That's a great answer. Unfortunately, we'll have to be the last one tonight as we're approaching the top of the hour. So thank you so much, Allison, LaMarr, Leslie, Wilbur, Deneen, and Lindsay, for taking time out of your busy schedules to share your important stories and experiences with the Hopkins community tonight. I also like to thank everyone who tuned in to listen to our conversations today. We hope that you enjoy the discussion, and we'd love to see many more of you at other Black Alumni Weekend events this week, including tomorrow's What's the Tea with current students in the beautiful new Bloomberg Student Center, and our Black and Blue Social on Friday in Baltimore. So thank you all for showing up and having a great time. And it's almost the top of the hour, so we bid you a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.